Hi guys, my name is Pascal Ungerer. I'm currently the artist in residence here at the Uillinn West Cork Art Centre. I started my residency here about 3 weeks ago, which coincidentally coincided with the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. So it's been a kind of a surreal experience so far. When I started the residency here, there were a lot of classes going on, there was a lot of people in the building, and within about a week of being here, the building went into lockdown. So a lot of the time I found myself one of the only people in the building, and there's a lot of kind of big empty spaces. I suppose for those of you that aren't familiar with the Uillinn, it's a very big imposing building, and there's a lot of very large kind of rooms, so being in this kind of space when you're on your own is, yeah, it's kind of a bit kind of surreal and almost a kind of an eerie aspect to it as well. But I actually kind of enjoy that in a way, and I think it's kind of conducive to kind of making work as well. And I hope that kind of like atmosphere of emptiness and stuff kind of comes out in some of my work, because a lot of my work is very much like that. There's a sort of an absence of people in a lot of the kind of work that I do, so maybe that will reflect that in some kind of a way. Yeah, so in terms of me and my work, I moved back here about 6 months ago. I spent 3 years in London where I did a MFA at Goldsmiths University. I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship there. So yeah, I completed the MFA program in about 2 years, which was pretty tough, but yeah, it was a great experience as well. I'm going to just talk generally about my practice now, I think, because as I said, I've only been here for about 2 or 3 weeks now, so I think I've probably, I haven't had a chance to make too much work, but I'm going to be here till mid-June, so I hope to possibly do another talk towards the end of the residency where I'll talk more specifically about the work that I'll have done here in residence. So for now, I'll sort of go through how my practice has developed over the past 4, 5, 6 years, and talk a little bit about that. So I suppose my main interest as an artist would be in what I term, or what one could term, spatial cultures. And that essentially is our kind of relationship, or the relationship between people and place, and how we affect our surroundings. I have a particular interest in kind of marginal and peripheral landscapes and unusual structures such as abandoned factories, ruined buildings, military infrastructure, areas of ecological degradation, and really kind of places that are at the edge of human habitation, be that in a kind of a rural or an urban context. And yeah, I suppose I often kind of refer to these places as kind of like other landscapes, or kind of I view them as a sort of like an alternative landscape culture as well. And I'm kind of interested in how we kind of look at those kind of places as an artist. So yeah, I mean, as I said, I'm from West Cork originally, and yeah, people often ask me why I'm interested in these kind of peripheral landscapes. And for me, I guess it's, in a way, it's a kind of a difficult question to ask. You sometimes, as an artist, you're kind of drawn to certain ideas or things or landscapes, and you're not exactly sure why, but you have this kind of interest in them. But it is something I've thought about, and I suppose I'm from West Cork, as I say. Where I'm from in West Cork, Mizen Head is very much at the end of the country. I mean, the next stop is Nova Scotia, Canada, across the Atlantic Ocean, so it does feel very kind of peripheral there, and it also feels like a very kind of bleak and desolate landscape. It is like West Cork is a beautiful part of the country, but particularly in winter, it can have a very kind of a foreboding sense of kind of darkness and sort of desolation. But there's also like a very interesting ecology and environment there as well, So yeah, I started, and I suppose that's probably one of the reasons why maybe I'm interested in these kind of environments as well. It's because there's sort of an inherent connection between the kind of places that I photograph or paint and the kind of the places that I'm from. Even if there's sort of a lot of the places that I do work with as an artist are in maybe possibly more of an urban context. So yeah, I studied, just going back to how I studied as an artist, I studied art in the Crawford College of Art and Design. That's where I did my BA in Cork. I started that in 2012. I actually started as a mature student. I didn't study art until I was in my mid-30s actually. And so I came to art quite late in life. Prior to that, I worked as a a press photographer and a commercial photographer for a number of years. And I suppose at that time I was also doing a lot of my own kind of side projects as well. And one of the projects I did at that time was work on ghost estates. So ghost estates essentially were building developments that were left unfinished and that were abandoned during the economic crisis of 2008 and after that, when building developers essentially went bankrupt, so they were unable to kind of finish these projects. So I spent a lot of time driving around the country documenting these places. I must have photographed hundreds of these ghost estates. And I've been looking at work by, I suppose, people like Paul Seawright. He's, or was anyway, I think the director, I don't know if he still is the director of the School of Art in Belfast. And he also kind of documents a lot of these very kind of peripheral landscapes and people. And so that's, I think, also one of the things that got me kind of interested in that area. So yeah, I mean, I look at these ghost estates as a sort of a very kind of, I don't know, I suppose you could call it a visceral reminder of the kind of abstract forces that sort of instigated the financial crash, and I suppose this sort of culture of waste and mismanagement that was prevalent at the time. And yeah, I guess they're sort of symbolic of this of kind of abandonment and obsolescence, but they're also a very kind of liminal environment and interstitial. Interstitial is a sort of an in-between space or an intervening space, and that's how I kind of view these places. They're sort of in between construction and neglect, in between habitation and abandonment, in between the urban and the rural. And they act as a sort of an intersection of these kind of divergent environments in a way. So yeah, I'll just show you some of those images there of that project on ghost estates. So these were taken all over the country. And I guess a lot of people would be familiar with the French writer Victor Hugo. He wrote Les Miserables. And he kind of described this kind of intersection in that work, you know, this kind of this place in between country and city, you know, in the kind of the suburban outskirts of Paris. And I'll just read a small passage from that. To observe the city edge is to observe an amphibian. End of trees, beginning of roofs, end of grass, beginning of paving stones, end of ploughed fields, beginning of shops, end of beaten track, the beginning of the passions, the end of the murmur of things divine, the beginning of the noise of humankind. So I suppose he's kind of describing that you know, that beginning of the city at the edge of the country, and the change of noise and senses and sound, and it's that kind of in between space that I'm interested in my work. So when I started at the Crawford, I started going back through some of my old photographs of ghost estates, and I decided that I would use those as some source material for making new work. And I didn't really want to use that work to comment on ghost estates per se, but it was more looking at the kind of landscape that these places were in. And I used that, I made these kind of mixed media paintings with that work. So that's one of them there now. So that was oil on a kind of a mosaic of lots of different prints that were stitched together. I actually used just tissue paper and put it onto board. And there's another one, that one's called Passage. And at that time, actually, one of my favourite books is a book called Edgelands. It was written by two British poets, Paul Farley and Michael Simmons Roberts. Actually, to give the book its full title, it's Edgelands: Journeys into England's True Wilderness. So I'll just read a small passage from that as well. Revisit an Edgeland site you haven't seen for 6 months, and likely as not there will be a Victorian factory knocked down, a business park newly built, a section of waste ground cleared and landscaped, a pre-war warehouse abandoned and open to the elements. Such are the constantly shifting sands of Edgelands that any writing about these landscapes is a snapshot. I think that's one of the things I found interesting about these places as well, is they are very much a kind of a landscape in flux. You know, they're constantly changing, and you know, they're different and hard to pin down in a way. You know, they don't conform to normative notions of landscape ecology or aesthetics, and you know, and as I said, for me they're very kind of other landscapes, and I guess they're kind of subversive by their very nature. And a lot of these for me, a lot of these peripheral landscapes are very reminiscent of, you know, writing by people like J.G. Ballard, for example, or films like Andrei Tarkovsky, you know, like Stalker comes to mind. And I suppose they're what like French anthropologist Marc Auger called as non-places as well. A lot of them are, and by non-places he means places that are transient, you know, such as motorways, industrial parks, roundabouts, shopping centres, places that we kind of pass through, you know, rather than live in, I suppose, in a way. But they can also be dystopian landscapes of waste ground and abandonment on the fringes of the built world, and yeah, as I said, you know, an intersection between urban and rural. So yeah, as I mentioned before, I'm interested in the sort of socio-geographic elements of these landscapes as well. So when I graduated from the Crawford in 2016 for my degree work, I did a project called Edge of Place. That work looked at borders in Europe. So I'll just show you a couple examples of that. So just preceding that, actually, in my penultimate year in the Crawford, I did an Erasmus at the Hungarian University of Fine Art. So I spent a bit of time in Hungary, and I became quite interested in these sort of the architecture from Soviet times. So when I did my degree show, I decided I'd go back there and document some of the old border stations and some of the infrastructure along the borders between Hungary and Austria, and then Slovakia and the Czech Republic as well. This was kind of in 2015 and 16 as well, so you know, borders were quite contentious because of the whole mass refugee exodus from the Middle East, which was at its peak at the time. You know, a lot of these borders had been closed down during the Schengen Agreement, and there was a lot of contention over that. I guess that's probably one of the reasons why I became interested in those spaces. So yeah, that work was not just about, you know, East and West Europe in a way. I documented some of the former internal boundary between East and West Germany, which is actually very hard to find any infrastructure left from that place, because there's a few bits in Berlin, but very little really. And also, but I didn't really want the project, as I said, to be around between East and West Europe. It was more about the kind of the landscape of borders and this obsolescence of the infrastructure within that space. So I went to Northern Ireland and I tried to kind of get some footage of the border there. But again, there's very little of that border left. I mean, really it's just a kind of a cultural, political and economic border. It's not a tangible geographic one. So that kind of made it quite difficult for me to get any footage. So I decided I'd go to Belfast, and I did some footage along the Peace Wall there, on the Shankill Road and the Falls Road, both sides of the community. And yeah, and I suppose this work really looked at borders being a physical and an abstract concept that delineate boundaries that define nationhood, identity and division. And for me, they're very much a kind of an ephemeral and cyclical landscape. These kind of places change as the sort of political landscape changes and the economic landscape changes. And ultimately, these are places that are shaped by this kind of legacy of conflict and mobility and division. And I think that's one of the things that I find sort of fascinating about them as well. So yeah, that's another it's an old border station in Hungary. So yeah, and that was from border control station as well, I think, in the Czech Republic. So yeah, so one of my other interests as an artist over the years has been in found film. Actually, when I was in Hungary in 2014, I was kind of exploring an old military base there, Soviet military base. I mean, it was a huge site, must have been over about 200 or 300 acres. They had, you know, everything there. There was like an airstrip there. They must have housed thousands of soldiers there at the time. And one of the buildings I found there was this kind of old, it must have been some kind of like cinema room where they had like a projector and stuff. No, the projector was gone, but they had all these old films just left on the ground there. These kind of reels of black and white negatives and films, you know, completely covered in dirt and most of them completely destroyed. But you you could kind of still see the remnants of some imagery on them, and so I kind of collected a few of these and cleaned them up and took them home, and I just found them fascinating really to look at, you know. So I used them to make a project as well called Homeward Bound. So it was a kind of essentially a large scale book that I made with the photographs, and then I also edited a video. That's the installation view of it. These are some documents I found on that army site as well, and I used some of the video or the negatives and films I found along with other films I collected, you know, at flea markets, on eBay, and so this is an installation view or a video of how the actual book would look like. So as I said, that project was called Homeward Bound. I suppose I was also kind of, this was also at the time of the migration of, or the exodus rather, of people into Europe from the Middle East. And again, not that this work was about that, but I suppose I kind of cast an eye on that as well, and this idea of transience and exodus, and I tried to kind of select maybe imagery that would evoke that sense of transience in a way, in a kind of in a time of kind of political upheaval. So yeah, that's what that project was called. It was called Homeward Bound. Yeah, so I mean, I've made other projects with found film as well. I have a friend, Helio Leon. He's a Spanish photographer, and he knows of my interest, I suppose, in found film. And he told me about this site in Madrid, near where he grew up, in the suburbs of Madrid, where there was like an old farm, and he said in the past he found a lot of old films that had been discarded there. So, of course, I was immediately interested by that, and I decided to go to Madrid and see if there were any more films there. And yeah, there were quite a lot there. I mean, they had been burnt and piled with more rubbish and debris, so you know, we had to literally excavate them out of the ground. It was almost like a kind of an archaeological dig in a way. I mean, a lot of the films had been burnt, and again, they were sort of barely visible. But it was just really, really interesting material. So when I was in Goldsmiths, I decided I'd use some of that material for a project called Fugitive Layers, and I made a video work with it, and I also made kind of digital collages. So I'll just show some of the video work. This was called Erasure. Essentially, it is one of the video reels I found there, and I re-edited it and I turned it into a positive image from a negative into a positive, and I kind of created this sort of soundtrack for it as well that I hoped would kind of evoke this sort of sense of degradation and decay. And I suppose for me, it's really interesting because this sort of decay of, you know, site and material creates this kind of synthesis in a way, you know, between the sort of the geology of the site and the materiality of the film. And for me, you know, because this stuff was found on kind of waste ground, and it's broken film, and I found that kind of fascinating as well. Also, these kind of ghostly images of the people you can kind of just about see there, you know. And I guess in this work I was trying to kind of capture sort of a fleeting moment of decay in a way, and ultimately this work is about, you know, visibility, fragmentation, entropy, you know, through this sort of prism of time and decay. But yeah, so that's one of the reasons I was really interested in that work. I also, so that video is called Erasure. As I said, I also used that material to make some digital collages as well, and I'll just fast forward onto that now in a second. So this piece here is called Interstice, and essentially how I made that is I took lots and lots of the images and I digitally stitched them together to make this kind of digital collage. So that was one of them, and this is another one that was done the same way. So these are just, you know, you can see how damaged the images were. Like, you couldn't really see any sort of viable image in a lot of them. So I used that sort of aesthetic of decay to kind of create something. This piece is called Mask, you know, because I wanted it to sort of reflect how, you know, a lot of the images were hidden as well behind this sort of mask of decay in a way. So I used parts of those projects for my MFA show in Goldsmiths, and I made another work as well, which was called Vanishing Point. Don't have the video of that, but I'll just show you some of the video stills for that. And essentially the way I made that was I'd take a video and I would kind of duplicate it and reverse it and stitch it together to make a kind of an elongated video. These are some just stills from the video. And it was really just work that looked at these kind of like peripheral and liminal and surreal places that are on the edges of the built environment. You know, there was some abandoned nuclear testing facilities, unfinished building developments, industrial infrastructure, and really these kind of like edgeland enclaves on the margins of development. In a work that I thought was a sort of a kind of a contemplative meditation on these kind of dystopic and peripheral places, you know, against the backdrop of an uncertain future in a way. I guess a lot of my work sort of looks at things like the Anthropocene, which is this, I suppose, this geological era of when we've started to, humankind has started to affect our environment and damage it through industrial ecology. And yeah, that's one of the things I was looking at in that work. So I used parts of that work and the Fugitive Layers project in my final show there, and that was the installation view of part of the installation view of some of the work I showed there at that time. So yeah, that's pretty much it. As I said, I hope to give another talk towards the end of my residency in June, where I'll talk a bit more about my work. But yeah, that's it for now. Thanks for yeah. Look after yourselves. Thank you.